Hey, this week on LokadTV, we're lucky enough to be joined by Axelle Lemaire. Axelle previously worked as the Minister for Digital Affairs under the François Hollande government and has recently taken on a new role as the global head of Terra Numerata. Today, we're going to get her views on the topic of digitalization and understanding how her new role she is bringing together both startups and technology companies alike in order to bring them together in what is an increasingly more competitive digital world. So Axelle, thanks very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Hi.
Perhaps you could start by just sort of telling us a little bit more about kind of your background. Sounds very interesting and very varied.
So yes, I did work as a government minister. That was between 2014 and 2017 for 3 years, in charge of innovation and digital affairs, digital policies for France. Extraordinary job at a moment when the world was discovering the power of startups, right? And how digital innovation would transform business models. Before that, I was elected as an MP, a member of parliament, to represent the French people living abroad in the north of Europe. And this is when I wrote a parliamentary report on what Europe would need to become a digital power.
And now you're sort of working as sort of the global head of Terra Numerata, which is kind of the digital arm of Roland Berger. Yeah. Perhaps you could just sort of tell us a little bit more about that as well.
Of course. So Roland Berger is a global consulting firm specialized in strategy and transformation, German of origin, but very international now. And Terra Numerata is a sort of open, global as well, platform, ecosystem, network of companies, mainly very technological and innovative companies we work with on projects that we deliver to our clients.
Okay, great. And as always, we're joined by Johannes. Today we're talking a bit more about digitalization. It's kind of a topic that we've spoken about in a few kind of previous episodes, but maybe it'd be nice to have just a quick overview of what digitalization is.
I mean, that's the interesting thing is that companies, at least in Europe and North America, have been digitalized for decades in a way. I mean, there is very few companies that have, let's say, that are still using paper trails. I mean, for example, nowadays, invoices, payments, all of that lives through computers records, but they have been, digital for decades. Yet, and that's the crux of the change, is that did companies just, digitalize what was the physical paper trail, or did they took opportunity to reinvent themselves with, I would say, computer capabilities, networking capabilities, and really rethink how they operate? And that, I believe, the crux of digitalization is not, I would say, thinking of digital capabilities as just bookkeepers, to just record your stuff, just like you were doing it with papers, but just, I would say, slightly faster and slightly error prone, but to completely rethink entirely how you do it, to do it in a way that are vastly more efficient, vastly more competitive, etc. And here, the way I see that is that it's quite a challenge at so many levels.
And you sort of mentioned at the start that you sort of worked a lot with sort of startups. I mean, it's a really kind of vibrant marketplace now. There seems to be sort of a new startup every day that's promising to completely revolutionize the digital industry. I mean, what's your kind of take on that?
Well, in the history of digitalization, I agree that we've come to a point where it's not tech only. And I'll get back to the to all these wonderful startups, but it's that what's at stake is change, and it's that depends on strategy, on mindset, and culture. So digitalization a couple of years ago still meant dematerializing process, documents, etc., etc. And even in the public sector, in government, you would think, dematerialization. Then it began increasingly to be about e-commerce, and how do a physical business can also have an online dimension. And then it was also about information and the power of social networks. And so how, as a citizen or a government member or a business person, you integrate that dimension maybe by introducing a collaborative work tool for your company. But now where we are with digitalization is it's really how it's transforming the business models. How a classic industrial company is become a servicial company, a platform providing services thanks to an open ecosystem, right? And so this, again, can only happen if people receive specific training, if they understand the startup culture, that it's test and learn, and that it's right to fail, and that it's probably more collective and collaborative, and so that means injecting that new culture within large organizations that are complex, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge. So to get back to the startup scene, it's vibrant. That's the case in France, but I mean, in the rest of the world as well. And we got to a point where the funding issue is not so much a problem anymore. I think the main challenge for startups now is their go-to-market. This is what I get to see at Roland Berger, is that it's still difficult to make them work with their big clients all across the world. And so because it's, to transform their pilot or their proof of concept on one use case to a potential application to all the different business departments, and then to really take advantage of the potential of technologies to help that transformation of the business model, that's the trickiest part.
Yeah. And what are your kind of views here? I mean, 10 years ago, you were kind of one of these little startups. We're now sort of grown up a bit bigger. We're sort of around the corner from Station F. There's plenty of sort of startups there. What are your kind of views?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Axelle in saying that, funding used to be a problem, not so much, I would say so much anymore. I mean, Station F, which is 200 meters from here, you can literally see that they have at the wall entrance, they have half a dozen of VCs who have their own offices, on site, and there is literally dozens of startups who have direct access to VCs who have, I would say, very significant funds at their disposal. I mean, collectively, we're talking of several billions. I believe when I started Lokad, at the time, that was 11 years ago, I think that the entire budget, yearly for France in VC funding was something like €500 million. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure that it's at least five times more.
It was non-existent.
Yeah,
and I think the Public Investment Bank in France, which might look as a weird model if, people abroad are listening to us, it really played a big role.
Absolutely.
Because it fueled that investment scene, and by co-investing with private VCs, including foreign funds, we're a bit skeptical to start with. It really helped give that push, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I
no, absolutely. I mean, indeed we have good contact with BPI, and it's a fantastic tool, and I would say even that surprisingly in terms of paperwork, and I would say with administration, they are really, I would say, they're quite good. I mean, obviously it's a lot of process, but comparatively to many administration, it actually feels quite smooth, I would say. Mm. But you're completely correct. I mean, and in the case of, for example, Lokad, of transforming a pilot, one of the biggest challenges that we have in supply chain is that it's all about network effect. So we have the same problem, but worse, because in supply chain, the naive, resolution of problems mostly don't solve problems but displace them. For example, if you have, let's say, a retail network with plenty of stores, if you decide to focus intensively on one store for inventory allocation, then maybe this store is going to run super smoothly, but at the expense of the other stores. So you've kind of micro solved a problem at one place, but creating problems on another place, and that's what supply chain is about. Whenever you allocate inventory in one place, then the same inventory can be missing from another place. which for Lokad makes the problems, I would say, even more complicated, because small-scale pilots tend to not work at all, precisely due to the very to the fact that supply chain problems are all networking problems, and that you cannot really locally demonstrate the value of what you're doing. But nonetheless, the problem is the same. We are struggling like hell to conquer larger companies because they are complex. They operate in many countries. We are still, we are doing the majority of our turnover outside France. But nonetheless, we don't have physical presence in many countries. Actually, we are still only located in Paris, France, which is a nice place to be. But yes.
Especially in the supply chain field, where the environment is complex for a multinational company with different offices and around the world, then what data analytics and the power of quantitative supply chain can bring is actually reveal the reality. It's transparency, right? And then once that is revealed, decisions at a more global level can be taken accordingly. But then if you stick to the sort of lower level or intermediary level, you don't take advantage of the full possible impact of integrating such technologies. So that's why it's so tricky, I believe, to start a pilot at the local level, and then when you know that the potential will be fulfilled at the global level.
And can you see any sort of negatives to this kind of increasing reliance on digitalization? Because you kind of look, an example is last year at Gatwick Airport, the whole sort of departures and arrival system failed, and suddenly you've got huge delays with flights and people writing flight times on whiteboards, and it's causing absolute carnage. Is there any real negatives to this digitalization?
Clearly, few companies, realize that, but indeed there is some kind of fragilities that comes with highly sophisticated, I would say, digital system. They can be made very resilient. They can. It doesn't necessarily mean that many companies have taken action to make them super resilient. For example, I know that there was a wave of ransomware, that in 2018, impacted many large companies, and it was very impressive to see that within 24 hours, the ransomware, which is kind of a virus, where basically if you want to I would say restore the situation, you have to pay a ransom, typically in Bitcoin, but where basically the virus had spread over literally all the countries of the companies within a single day, precisely because it was kind of the same system deployed everywhere. And so I would say the upside of having systems that are completely compatible and completely aligned is that if you have a security problem, it's the same security problems everywhere. In contrast, if it's a complete mess with different ERPs, incompatible systems, then the upside of that is that if people gain access to a system, they don't by default gain access to everything.
What it means, what I get to see in terms of the governance of organizations is that now, yes, there's clearly a real awareness of the cyber risks in particular.
Yes.
Which wasn't the case 5 years ago, believe me. When we launched the national strategy for cyber protection in France 5 years ago, it was still pretty new, and companies were not ready to spend the investment necessary to protect themselves. So this is progressively changing, but what it means is that the IT department is not seen any longer just as the unit that will say no to everything. They've become a strategic asset by themselves. So they're also regaining power in some ways and working more closely with the innovation department and with the business units. So it's interesting to see how, and so I suppose maybe to the pure players, they don't have an IT department. Digital technologies are so much at the heart of their business model. So but this in more classic organizations, we're seeing this change of IT working closer to the chief data officer and the chief digital officer and the chief innovation officer, and they're deploying solutions together with a shorter time to market. So interesting, but I still believe that leaders do not understand that risk zero doesn't exist. So in a digital world, we have to admit, we have to accept that in spite of all the necessary investment for protection, we live in a risky world. And so that means also in terms of insurance contracts, a lot of consequences, right?
But that's very interesting because, for example, the risk question is very interesting because, for example, you see one of, an element of, I would say, a tech element of Lokad is probabilistic forecast. So we say, we give up on the idea of having perfect demand forecasts. It's like forever fuzzy, especially, for example, when you think of fast fashion. It's a bit like wishful thinking to imagine that you will have perfect forecasts and then that you can have zero risk of stock out. And yet, when we move towards something that kind of embrace the fact that risk zero do not exist, we are still, I would say, facing situations that are difficult because companies need to come to terms with the consequence of that. So you need to deeply embrace that indeed it's wishful thinking to have risk zero, and then it boils down to have very smart prioritization of your investment and trying to mitigate your risk, because giving up on the zero risk doesn't mean that you don't do anything on to assess risk. And our perspective is that, on the contrary, it means that you need to be very smart on prioritization, because you see, if you say zero risk, you don't have to prioritize anything. That's the beauty of it. You say, we are going to address every single problems, period. So you need to embrace the fact that the consequence of that risk zero does not exist, which is a smart prioritization of what you do. And here, it's very interesting because what we see is that it entails so many things that are quite different. For example, and it's frequently it's very counterintuitive when it comes to pure IT security. For example, NSA in the US has emitted recommendation that forcing people to rotate passwords is now considered harmful. It actually generates more problems than it solves problems, because when you ask people to change their password every 3 months, what most people would do, they would have a sticker attached to their computer with their password written on it. And they have observed that no matter how much training you give to people, they will still do that. So let's stop rotating those passwords all the time. It actually creates more problems.
I mean, I definitely agree with what you're saying about the passwords. I seem to have passwords sort of coming out of my ears at the minute and don't know what to do with them all.
Yeah, but you just buy a nice license with a good app that will automatically generate your passwords, and then it's no longer a problem.
Let's sort of start wrapping things up a little bit now. Let's look at some of the digital trends for kind of the future, and what's exciting that's coming up, and what are the opportunities that you can see coming from them?
Now that I work as a consultant, if I talk about AI, people will start laughing, right? Because when you ask data scientists about artificial intelligence, they'll say, the AI is for PowerPoint presentations. That's not our real life, right? So, but still, I would say I get to see many startups every day. And what I realize is how transformative the algorithmic developments based on machine and deep learning are to transform organizations. So again, so that might not be the very long-term trend of quantum informatics or quantum computing, but what in the next, I would say, 2 to 3, 4 years, again, the biggest exciting challenge will be to manage to adopt these technologies and adapt them to organizations. So to me this, and yes, it is around machine learning and deep learning, right? And we're still so much only at the beginning, because we're struggling to identify not the easy use cases, usually around cost optimization, cost reduction, or it's really about inventing new use cases and added value, and helping companies to switch to new business, new products, thanks to the right algorithmic development. So that to me is the most exciting trend not to come. Actually, we're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something you'd probably agree with to a certain extent, with the rise of sort of differentiable programming and things like that.
Absolutely, and indeed, it's a challenge to invent the new use case. For example, in supply chain, you have the decades-old use of statistical learning, machine learning, and the descendant for demand forecasting. But the classical perspective is very narrow. You say you take a product that is already selling, and you just extend the time series of sales into the future. That's machine learning, all right. But it's also taking a very narrow and now quite ancient perspective. And for example, 1 week ago, I was meeting with the CEO of a very dynamic fast fashion brand. And this person was telling me, what I would really be interested in would be the same sort of tech, but applied to the genesis of new bestsellers for my fast fashion brand. So it's a different problem. Instead, because you were saying, what is the point of forecasting the demand of I would say of a bad product? A product that is not going to become a success in the market. Yes, I will get the forecast, but anyway, it's not going to make anything super good for my business. Yes, it will limit the amount of excess inventory I have for this poorly performing product. But in a way, I'm not solving the crux of the problem, which is how do I gain market share by, launching ahead of my competitors product that really capture, what the mood of the time, so that people spot my clients spot my price. Say, this is it. This is what I was expecting from for this season. And can we have not the machine that will replace designer, but just have them to pinpoint the area where they should really focus. And that's interesting, because it's not actually radically new tech-wise, but it was still kind of new to me, I would say, in terms of way of thinking how this technology should be applied to this business. And that's very, very interesting.
And maybe to conclude, one of the trend that I'm seeing is tech for good. And so it's positive impact technologies. So trying to think about the case you just mentioned, fast fashion, tech for good, how technologies can help fight climate change. Not sure. Yes, actually, if you find the right use case to help fast fashion producers to produce locally according to local demand and the quantities that are needed, then you don't overproduce, right? And so that to me is a good example of how do you try to mitigate negative externalities and even better create positive impact, especially for the environment, thanks to technologies, but also by addressing business challenges. So to me, this questioning of how technologies can serve a broader interest, which is not only business, but not only, will be key for the future in coming years.
Okay, great. Nice positive way to kind of finish things up. So thanks both for your time this morning.
Thanks. You.
So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.